accountability, we got a strike force, and then eliminating the local production of methamphetamine. So those strategies, just kind of think about that a little bit. Those strategies allowed us to put a dent in meth and protect kids. And those numbers have gone down. The number of drug-affected babies in Marion County has plummeted because of those particular efforts. That said, the concept of neglect prevails. And the number of children, these are very recent statistics for Marion County, the number of children who experience repeat maltreatment is well above the national average. And the length of stay in care is years. And in particularly for chronic neglect, for those kids that are like 13 to 17. So we're really struggling in that arena. I see some of our juvenile folks here, and that's an area that's really challenging. What does neglect mean? Well, to the point, pot-smoking parent who allows a toddler to walk off in the street in their diaper at 11 p.m. is neglect. A pot-using parents who leave the product laying around the house, that level of accessibility is neglect. A pot-smoking boyfriend who drives the children to a bar and he goes in there is neglect. That's direct endangering. It's the concept of accountability. Nearly half, 44% of found in child abuse cases in 2013 involved substance abuse. I think that figure is low. I think the Department of Human Services is lowballing that. I think it's higher. So, our youth are wonderful, but they are indeed vulnerable. They are indeed impressionable, being a parent. And in my experience, they often take the path of least resistance and greatest acceptance. And I'm worried about that. I worry about that every day. And what you see in our homes, I saw some educators here, they can correct me with questions if I'm wrong. What you see in our homes is what you're likely to see in our schools. That's been our experience. That will translate, increased use will translate and fuel increased prevalence in the school settings, coupled with an irresistible market of marijuana indulgence. That's exactly the path that many of our kids would likely take. So, thanks for listening to me. As a parent and your district attorney, I'm deeply concerned.
Thank you, Walt. Walt is a great public servant for Marion County. And now we have the privilege of listening to Dr. Kevin Sabet. Dr. Sabet has served as the Director of Drug Policy of the Drug Policy Institute at the University of Florida, as well as Assistant Professor in the College of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. He has been a consultant to numerous domestic and international organizations, including the United Nations. He has served as Senior Advisor to the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy and is a regular contributor to various media outlets. Dr. Sabet has published widely in peer-reviewed journals and books on substance abuse topics. He received his PhD and MS in social policy at Oxford University. So now, thank you for welcoming Kevin Sabet.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank Mountain West, and, along with the Sheriff's Association and the Medical Society, for having me here this afternoon, and thank all of you for taking time out to hear about this topic that apparently has caused some people some little controversy, I hear. But I also think that it's something that is definitely needed to have a dialogue on really a drug that I think is very misunderstood. And I think a lot of misunderstandings stem from the fact that people often translate their own experiences with marijuana, especially. Of course, this happens with a lot of things, but with marijuana especially, they translate their own experiences into thinking that that must be the experience for everyone else. And I think that as a result of really the harms of marijuana, 70 years ago being over-exaggerated also, there's a lot of mistrust and a lot of sort of angst around trying to have a sensible discussion about this issue. And so things get mischaracterized all the time, and it becomes sort of political kind of football game. And we can't, it sort of muddies the water. It doesn't allow us to have a rational discussion about what the major medical associations and scientific groups are saying about this particular substance. And for some reason, it's marijuana more than really any other substance that brings this kind of emotion and passion really on all sides of it. So trying to strip the conversation today of that and really just talk about the things that, if you would attend the American Medical Association annual conference, or the American Society of Addiction Medicine, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, what are the things you might hear there about this issue of marijuana? So if we can go to the next slide. Just to give some grounding, I'm going to just throw out some statistics so that we kind of know where we are. Obviously, Americans like to consume substances. We are in the per capita, although some other countries are coming up, but still the largest drug consumer in the world. And the top 3 substances, psychoactive substances that we use, are alcohol at around between 50 and 60% of all Americans regularly drink. About 20 to 25%, depending on which study you're looking at and which age groups, but generally 20 to 25% of adults that smoke cigarettes regularly, and regularly is once every 30 days. By the way, I'm very shocked by that number of 26 or 20%, because there's been so much really success on smoking. I mean, on the sort of talking about the health harms of smoking. I don't even know where you can legally smoke these days. I think if you went home, you'd be likely kicked out of the house by your significant other or your kids. The amount of stigma around tobacco is just unreal compared to where we were even 15 or 20 years ago. And yet still, even with all that information and with the fact that I don't think anybody defends the tobacco industry anymore, I don't think anybody, after 100 years of lies and deceit, questioned the link between tobacco and lung cancer. By the way, I like to see a show of hands. How many people think that the link between tobacco and lung cancer was first discovered in the 1960s, when we had the Surgeon General's report? Anybody think it was earlier than the 1950s? How about earlier than the 1940s, 30s? Well, we have a very smart crowd here. Yeah, it was about the 1910s and 1920s that the first evidence on lung cancer and tobacco emerged. Of course, the government didn't admit it for 40 years, and the tobacco industry didn't admit it for 80 years. But it's just interesting to see that and kind of where we've been. And then, of course, for marijuana, which is why we're here today to talk about 7.5% of Americans, according to the most recent survey, 12 and older, regularly use. Now, you can go to the next slide. Now, obviously, when we talk about kids, that's different. Oh, by the way, this is just a slide showing overall illicit drug use, which is 95% of it driven by marijuana, over the last 40 years. We're not anywhere near the peak of drug use of where we were in the late 1970s in this country, when we had a much higher rate, but we've certainly seen an increase over the last 10 years or so. And now 9.4% of all Americans are consuming illicit drugs. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the vast majority of that is marijuana, the blue trend line. The prescription drugs, even though we've had more deaths and actually more emergency room admissions and treatment admissions for prescription opiate addiction, the actual use rates are relatively flat over the last 10 years, which is interesting. And just another interesting point is that cocaine is really dramatically fallen over the last 10 years or so. But really, marijuana, especially over the last 4 or 5 years, is driving the increase in overall substance abuse that we've seen in this country. Let me go to the next slide. And of course, when we look at where alcohol, marijuana, and tobacco are, I think it's very interesting among young people. So this is actually regular use among 12th graders. And around 2008, we had something happen that hadn't happened since the mid-1970s. It happened, that's the last time it happened. And that was a crossover between cigarettes and marijuana for 12th graders. And now, in this country, we have more 12th graders consuming marijuana than cigarettes. And, you know, I do think that's interesting to think about when we think about what the implications are for marijuana use for the adolescent brain versus cigarettes. And I really dislike the conversation comparing one substance to another. I mean, the idea of, you know, what's worse, alcohol, cigarettes, marijuana, this or that, it's sort of like saying, what's worse, you know, jumping out of a 3-story building, a 7-story building, or a 10-story building. Well, they're all things you don't want to do. Maybe the 3-story building is maybe a bit more survivable, but it's not something that you would ever, you know, want to advocate for. And so I don't like the comparison, but it is important to look at, if we see that 12th graders smoking marijuana more than they're smoking cigarettes, the implications that has for our education system, I think, is enormous. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in depth, but when you think about what cigarettes do to the brain versus what marijuana does, it's very simple, and we'll make it very simple for tonight in terms of the effects. Cigarettes don't get you high, right? That's the bottom. Marijuana gets you high, cigarettes don't. So cigarettes are more addictive than heroin, by the way, but they don't produce that psychoactivity, that high that marijuana produces. And what that means, obviously, is when a kid goes to school, now more kids going to school smoking marijuana than cigarettes, that has big implications for learning, memory, and I'm going to talk about the areas of the brain that marijuana affects. But it is very different than going to school smoking cigarettes. Now, we wouldn't tell kids that they should go to school and smoke cigarettes, but the effects of that are going to be found much later than they would that day when that kid is, right after that kid has smoked a cigarette. It's the same reason why we care a lot more about people that are driving under the influence of marijuana or alcohol, and most times it's together, than cigarettes. Because driving under the influence of cigarettes, actually, you haven't heard of a DUI for cigarettes, because they don't exist. You're not, that the fact that you don't feel that high has different implications. It's why you can go to, I wouldn't say you should, but you could build a building with a cigarette dangling from your mouth, and you're not going to be impaired as a result of using that cigarette, whereas for marijuana you are. And so when I see a statistic like that, I just think that needs to give us pause. We want to see reductions in all of those substances, not a substitution here that we might be seeing with marijuana and cigarettes. Next slide. And if you look at daily use, we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years in light green the increase in 12th graders daily using. And now we have 1 in 15 12th graders using marijuana daily. So that's 2 kids in every classroom. That is a tripling since the early 1990s. It's not as high as the 1970s, where we had 1 in 10, but it's getting there. And I think that is something we need to be especially worried about. Because, again, I'm not talking about the occasional use, although we don't want kids to be even occasional use, but that is very different than daily use. And when we start talking about the kids that are using marijuana on a daily basis when they're going to school, that has major implications, which I will get into details about what the studies will show. You can skip a couple, maybe keep going, I'm going to talk about this later for a little while. And one of the reasons, of course, we've seen this increase has been a reduction in the perception of risk. So when we do surveys of young people and ask them, well, how risky do you think it is to smoke marijuana? The percentage of those thinking it's risky has really fallen. You can go to the next slide. And this is actually a direct, what's interesting is the direct mirror imaging that we've seen of perception of risk in red and past year use in green. In other words, the more risky, the less risky that, in this case, 12th graders view marijuana, the more likely they are to use it. And that's been the case really for the last 40 years. So one of the best predictors of use is our attitudes about it. So why should we care about that at all? We're seeing those statistics, maybe, why do we even need to care about this in the first place? And I actually talk about this in detail in my book, Read for Sanity, which has all the citations and things you're going to want about all of this stuff. And essentially, if you go to the next slide, we'll go through the first myth, which is the idea that marijuana is harmless and not addictive. And again, I think this is where the baby boomer generation and the millennials and younger have a very, very big disconnect. because essentially the product and the way that it was used, during the Summer of Love or Woodstock, in the 60s, is very, very different than now. And I think that's why we see that disconnect. And if you want to just first, let's sort of review some of the things relating to the brain. We actually know that we have receptors, cannabinoid receptors, throughout our brain and our body that essentially regulate things like movement, sensation, judgment, memory, coordination, vision, all kinds of things. Pain, appetite, reproductive system, immune function, overall brain development. And what happens when someone ingests marijuana is marijuana has over hundreds of components in it, but the main component is called THC. You'll hear me refer to that a lot. That's what gets somebody high, right, is the THC. If it didn't have THC in it, you wouldn't be getting high. That is the characteristic about marijuana that produces the effect, the psychoactive effect. And what we know is that THC, when marijuana is ingested, essentially binds to all of these receptors that are in the brain and located throughout the body. And now, what matters is not all brains are alike, and the adolescent brain is very different than the adult brain. So when that happens to the adolescent brain, essentially you are unnaturally utilizing these receptors in ways that wouldn't normally. So, for example, with food or sex, of course, dopamine and other things go up in terms of that means you are excited by them, you want to go back to them, and that's a natural mechanism that occurs in all humans. We have to eat, we have to reproduce to survive as a species. So it makes sense that our brain tells us when we do that, you need to do that again, that was good, go back to it. And what all drugs of abuse do is essentially artificially do that to ourselves. With that dopamine gets flushed in ways that really weren't intended, in ways that our brains really don't, off the charts compared to food or sex or other things, or any other pleasurable activity. And so over time, that has some of the damaging effects that we see, because essentially those parts of the brain, or those parts of the bodies that are regulating those things that are so important are dull and are difficult to manage. So what happens with the adolescent brain versus the adult brain is that the adolescent brain is essentially under construction until age 30. Okay? So that means that everyone under 30 here, you have a lot of hope, a lot of things you can do. Over 30, no, I'm just kidding. But basically, there's a lot, you can change a lot more when your brain is developing. And that is why we teach, when is it easier to learn a language? When you're 3 or when you're 50? Rosetta Stone or not. It's much more difficult when you're 50, trust me, than when you're 3. When do you learn how to ride a bike or swim? Right? Do you learn when you're 60 or when you're 6? Well, you learn when you're younger, and because essentially your brain is pruning, it's priming, it's more malleable, it's able to pick things up a lot better than when you're older. That's why we care about childhood trauma so much, frankly, more than adult trauma. Because that childhood trauma can stay with that child and that person for the rest of their lives. That's why we care about that so much. And so drugs, and obviously alcohol, of course, too, all drugs have the ability then to essentially hijack that brain, just like when you learn how to ride a bike or swim, that sticks with you for your whole life. For some people, that happens when it comes to drugs of abuse. And now, obviously, it doesn't happen to everyone that does it. And so let me be very clear here. I'm not saying that somebody that tries any drug of abuse, I mean, we're talking about marijuana tonight, we're talking about any other drug, that instantly means that brain is forever affected and there's really no turning back, or it's very difficult to turn back. Or that instantly means that person is going to have a bad life outcome. Or that instantly means that if they do this, they're going to be dumb, or they're going to get into a car crash. I'm not saying that. No one in the scientific community is saying that. But unfortunately, when we talk about this and we talk about the risk, I think certainly folks that may have had different experiences, in other words, they could be drug users and it's fine for them or whatever, they oftentimes, and this is why it's difficult to have a conversation, even with our neighbors about marijuana, is you'll always hear somebody say, but I know somebody who actually is fine, or I know somebody that didn't use heroin after marijuana, or I know somebody that, didn't get into a car crash. And of course, that's true. I mean, not everybody that engages in a risky behavior is going to have a negative outcome. I don't think that's what anybody is saying, but it is often mischaracterized. Now, how many people in here think that drunk driving is acceptable? Or how about not wearing a helmet when riding a motorcycle? Any hardcore motorcycle? There's a couple, yeah, there's usually one or two of the diehards, I understand. How about not wearing a seatbelt? Okay, no. So, yet, if you knew what the chances are of getting into a fatal car crash, if you don't do any of those things, you might be shocked. Basically, when you look at, for example, statistics from Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and you take the number of people that they claim are on the road every night drunk, legally drunk, versus those who get into a fatal car crash, you're talking about somewhere between 1 in 600 drunk drivers result in a fatal car crash to about 1 in 2,000. Some range of that. Let's be conservative for the sake of argument and say it's 1 in 600. In other words, it's higher than 1 in 2,000. Or that 99.9% of people who get in accidents with a helmet will survive versus those that don't. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person who drives drunk is going to get into a fatal car crash. The statistics show us the opposite. But we would never say, well, you know what, you're going to get away with it 599 times out of 600, so it's okay. Or, by the way, if you knew about the statistics of every person who's lit a cigarette in their life and then who have died of lung cancer, we're going to talk about similar numbers in terms of the chances. So when we hear these numbers that, and I want to thank Mr. Fraterni for his leadership, and when Walt talks about 1 in 6, which is right, 1 in 6 kids who try marijuana for the first time at age 16, according to research, actually that is about 15 or 20 years old. So I'd be interested to see the research with today's modern marijuana. But just to be conservative, that was from the 90s, but we'll just take it at its word, 1 in 6. I don't think that is a number just to disregard and think that's no big deal. Especially when you look at things that we really care about, like drunk driving, helmets, and seatbelts, the chances of a negative outcome are much lower than for the negative outcome we're talking about with marijuana in terms of, let's say, addiction. And but for some reason that gets lost in the debate because people translate and transfer their own experience or their experience of loved ones into thinking that everybody must be that way. And I think that's what muddles the discussion around. You can go to the next slide. Actually, here's a slide comparing addiction rates among drugs, which again, I don't like doing also because most people who are addicted to a drug are using multiple drugs at once. But let's just do it for the sake of argument. Yes, marijuana is lower. It's lower than alcohol. For young people, marijuana and alcohol are about equally as addictive. 1 in 6 number holds for alcohol, 16-year-olds. For 14-year-olds, for marijuana, it becomes 1 in 4, 14-year-olds who try. But for tobacco, it's actually 1 in 3 adults, and for heroin, it's 1 in 4. Now, we wouldn't therefore say, well, cigarettes are more addictive than heroin, so we're going to kind of give heroin a pass and really focus just on cigarettes. I don't think that is helpful to do that comparison, but it is interesting to just kind of look at the different estimated prevalence dependence among users percentage-wise across various substances. By the way, this same chart from the 90s shows that pain analgesics and psychedelics are lower, and stimulants are about the same as marijuana. I think that's very interesting. Next slide. You can keep going. And so I think the disconnect really comes down to the fact that today's marijuana and the potency, and also the way marijuana is consumed, okay, not just the potency, but the way you consume it, is vastly different than the experience of both baby boomers or generations older than that. Mainly because the potency of the drug, the strength, has been modified and manipulated to be increased, much more increased than it would naturally occur. So when I hear, oh, but marijuana has been used for 3,000 years by the Chinese and the pharaohs had it on their hieroglyphics, it's like the marijuana that the pharaohs might have used or the ancient Chinese, in terms of the potency, it doesn't even resemble the same kind of drug that kids are encountering today. Forget about ancient Chinese and pharaohs. Even the drug that the kids' parents today use doesn't resemble the marijuana that kids are using. And it's funny, I had just an experience of this the other day when I don't often get to speak to young people, but I was at a high school speaking to about 1,500 high school students. And the vice principal came, a woman probably in her mid-60s, came out, and she wanted to sort of identify with the topic and the kids and stuff, and she was trying her best. And she came out and said, you know, we're really excited to have Dr. Sabet here. He's going to be talking about, you know, that roach clip that gets passed around at your parties. When she said roach clip, the glazed faces that stared, I mean, these kids had, it's like she was speaking Japanese. They had no idea what she was saying, okay? And so she was sort of confused with that, and then somebody, that kind of went by, and then somebody raised their hand in the back and said, oh, okay, well, I guess you said he's gonna talk about marijuana. Is he gonna talk about dabs tonight? And she got very angry and said, dabs? No, he's talking about marijuana. Stop, you know, causing problems. By the way, if you don't know what dabs are, you're not alone. We'll talk about it in a little bit. But the point is that the generational divide about this, I mean, I think when she said roach clip, I think they thought she was talking about the kind of insect extermination technique, because no one had any idea what she was talking about. And the idea that the baby boomers, generations who might have used marijuana heavily in the 60s, 70s, even 80s and 90s, are able to communicate with young people about the marijuana that they're saying, I think is really difficult. And I think that that's why we see this disconnect. That's why we hear about parents who say, oh, well, you know, I'm going to introduce marijuana to my kid because, you know, I want him to use it in a safe environment with me. And again, I hate to break it to you, to the father, but you know, if your 16-year-old is wants to use marijuana with you, I guarantee he doesn't just only want to use it with you. I guarantee that he doesn't find it, you know, cool to say no to his friends, but yes to his dad when it comes to smoking marijuana. But again, this comes with a lot of the misinformation that we're seeing. And if you go to the next slide, I'll talk about the dabs in a minute, but let's talk more about what research over the last few years has given us about looking at marijuana users over the long term. Essentially what we're seeing, folks, is that, you know, it's a game of Russian roulette. It doesn't mean that every single marijuana user has this outcome, but essentially what we're finding is a direct dose-response relationship. What does that mean? It means that the more you use, the more likely you are to have these outcomes. And we can separate it by never used, you know, a couple of times used a few times in the last year, used a few times in the last week, used daily. And when you divide it up into those percentiles, essentially what you find is you're just much more likely, if you, especially as you use marijuana, to be welfare dependent, unemployed between the ages of 21 and 25, have lower personal income, and be less likely to graduate with a university degree. Now again, doesn't mean that every single daily user doesn't have a university degree. That's not what we're saying. But we're essentially saying you're taking the risk. And I don't think that those risks are properly understood by parents, let alone by kids today. And I always have somebody raise their hand and say, well, Kevin, you know, I was in a debate the other day, actually, where they said, Kevin, marijuana is a gateway drug. It's a gateway straight to the White House, because our last 3 presidents have used marijuana. Or you hear like, well, this famous, like I always, you know, I hear Steve Jobs used it, right? Like a lot. And if you ever seen the movie Jobs, it wasn't a great movie, but it was just interesting to see the development of Apple as a company, as one of the most successful companies today. Well, all these famous people, Carl Sagan, like the, you know, the father of modern astronomy, all these kinds of, and the issue is, yes, well, okay, not everybody is going to grow up to be Steve Jobs, Carl Sagan, or the president. And so, you know, when you have a lot going for you, and you already have you're already at way higher off the, you know, on the intelligence spectrum, you know, genius level. It's true that, you know, heavier marijuana use is less likely to hurt you. But the issue is not everybody is going to be Steve Jobs or the president or Carl Sagan. That's the problem. And I hate to break it to some of the parents in here. I know we're sort of near a school. Not every child can be a genius. I know, that's very hard to take for parents. And what I mean by that is, listen, if you have 150 IQ to start out with, and you lose some, I'm going to talk about the research showing the IQ reductions among heavy users, and you have let's say an 8-point reduction in IQ, and you're at 142, listen, you're still in the 99.99999 percentile. Okay, you haven't lost much with those 8 points if you've been smoking marijuana, but not every kid is 150 on the IQ scale. And the average IQ of the classroom is 100. So if the average IQ in any room or in any classroom is 100 and you lose those 8 points, and I'm going to talk about the research that showed that in a minute, that is a big deal. I mean, that is the difference. If that happens to you, that is the difference between, 1 degree, settling for one, an AA versus a BA or an MA. It is the difference between getting the job that you kind of have to just get bread on the table versus the job that you really want. Actually, scientists have quantified every point in IQ and how much lifetime income that brings. It's very interesting too. But the point is, it doesn't affect everybody, but you're taking the risk that it will affect you. And so you just basically increase your chances when that happens. You can go to the next slide. I think the other thing that we need, and I'm so glad that the district attorney brought this up, because it's just something that is really totally under-addressed completely. We do not know how to address it in this country, and that is the issue of mental illness. At this point, when we are seeing rising incidents of mental illness and incidents as a result of those of that increase, the idea that we want to add marijuana to the mix doesn't just worry me; it worries every major association like the American Psychiatric Association and National Alliance for Mental Illness and other groups. Because when you look at the chances of schizophrenia, you can go to the next slide, the chances of a psychotic episode and especially, now this graph, and I'm not going to get into all the details, this graph actually looks at your chances of getting schizophrenia or having a psychotic episode if you have certain genes which predispose you to them. And the issue is, you may not know if you have this gene or not, but if you do, and you're using marijuana heavily, you've just exponentially increased your chances for mental illness. The idea that we're not really talking about that as a country, I think, is a problem. And one of my colleagues, former Congressman Patrick Kennedy, who's really taken this on as an issue, he's sort of been pioneering this issue of mental health, and he did something in Congress along with Republicans from across the aisle where they worked together. I know that sounds like it's not part of this world, but even recently, a couple years ago, we were seeing folks from across the aisle working together, which I think is good. What they essentially got Congress to agree to was something revolutionary. It took Congress 50 years to even entertain this idea. And I know you're going to find it as revolutionary as Congress did because it took them so long. They basically convinced Congress that the brain was part of the body. Isn't that amazing? We finally took us 50 years to get our Congress, or our austere Congress, to come up with that. And what I mean by that is we're finally trying to begin, in a very clumsy fashion, but we're beginning to treat a mental illness the same way we treat a broken elbow or a sprained ankle. In other words, with proper treatment, covered by insurance, that's taken seriously, and not in a way that says, oh, you have a broken ankle, just get out of here. You get over it, you'll get better. Mine doesn't matter. We would never treat a broken ankle like that. And we treated mental illness like that since the founding of this country. We're just beginning to change that. And so we're in infantile stages of understanding and dealing with diseases of the brain. And so as we're learning all of this and we're learning more about the role of marijuana, I think, again, it should give us pause when we're having this discussion. You can click a couple times. Yeah. You can keep going. So essentially, today's marijuana is not the marijuana of the 60s, but it's not only the potency, like I said, it's also the way marijuana is taken. Next slide. And of course, it's kind of not earth-shattering that smoking anything is bad for your lungs. I mean, folks, you could smoke the best organic lettuce from Whole Foods. It would also be bad for your lungs if you smoke lettuce. So you can imagine that smoking marijuana is also probably not good for your lungs either. Now, if you go to the next slide, so the issue of bronchitis and cough and phlegm production are all associated. Lung cancer, actually, the evidence is very mixed. In fact, it's leaning against finding any clear association. Now, of course, it took us some time to find the association with tobacco, so it doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that we really do need more research on that. Probably the way that marijuana users consume marijuana versus the way they smoke it versus the way you smoke tobacco probably has a part in that discussion. But it's frankly very difficult to do that research because a lot of marijuana smokers also smoke cigarettes. So separating that out from a research perspective is difficult. But really, this has not been shown as of yet. The evidence is very mixed. Next slide. Here's just a quick graph on the IQ issue. So essentially what happened was there was a group of 1,000 people in New Zealand, in the 4th largest city, that are part of a scientist's, absolute dream. That's a longitudinal study. That means the same people are examined over the course of their entire life, every 5 to 10 years. And you learn all sorts of things about the way their environment and the way that their own nature has affected their own life. And so this wasn't a study on marijuana, it was just a study on all these people, 1,000 people. And then the last time, researchers decided to look at marijuana and see the role of marijuana in this. And essentially what they found was, among this, of course it was a small group of all the 1,000 that actually were using every day, but they found that, and it was a dose-response relationship, that those who used 3 times a week for about 3 to 4 years in adolescence, regardless of if they stopped when they were an adult, and regardless of if they drank or not. In other words, alcohol was not what they would say a confounder, and alcohol could not explain this outcome. And the outcome I'm talking about was the one I referred to earlier, the significant increase in the likelihood of a 6 to 8 point reduction in IQ. Now this study was dramatic because people couldn't believe it. That's a very strong statement. And I was looked at by a Norwegian group who said, you didn't look at the other factors, the socioeconomic factors. And these researchers went back actually immediately and said, actually we did, but we're going to do it again. And we found the same thing when we did it again. And by the way, we're going to look at the literature on rats and mice and look at the IQ literature there, because there's ways to test animals, obviously, for IQ. And they found the same thing. And actually what they said was, the last time we checked, rats did not have a socioeconomic status. So it was difficult to control for socioeconomic status of rats, but essentially they really found the same thing. Now this remains, I think, something we have to have further study on, because it was a dramatic finding. But I think the implications, especially on our education sector, is just something worth thinking about. Who gets penalized when kids do poorly in school with bad test scores? Anybody? Yeah, that's right, teachers, right, more than parents. In fact, their own jobs are on the line when kids do that. So when we think about the implications for our educators, and also not just their own jobs, but the implications for our country. I mean, folks, we rank 36 out of 37 in math in industrialized nations. We rank about 31 in science. We could be off by a couple, but this is essentially right, and somewhere in the 20s in reading. When I look at that, and I look at the global marketplace, and by the way, I look at the global prevalence of marijuana use in other countries that are coming up and giving us a run for our money in the global marketplace, countries like Brazil, countries like India, countries like China. Let's just put it this way, the marijuana use isn't anywhere near the levels of the United States. And I just think we have to pause as a society and think like, well, do we want our kids to get ahead or not? Do we want everything that's going to get them, we talk about racing to the top for education. Do we want anything that might hold them back? We're still learning about all this. All of this is new. But it's something that I think most Americans don't know about. And it's something that is constantly obscured, frankly, I think, by an industry similar to the industry when we have the tobacco industry. We can go to the next slide. Just press the button again. Another thing that's so interesting, we talk about the treatment admissions, and again, I was really happy that the DA brought up that issue. If you were to tell people in 1992 that the percentage of all treatment admissions for marijuana would ever be higher than for cocaine, you would be laughed out of the room. That's just not something that would be possible to think about. And yet, we do see that. Now, of course, most of the time it's marijuana and another drug. This is not happening in a vacuum, folks. I mean, the idea that kids say, okay, I'm going to choose one substance to really go crazy on, and I'm going to say no to everything else, that's difficult, especially when you add alcohol to the mix and prescription pain relievers, which are very easily accessible. Of course, most people who use marijuana don't use heroin. Of course, most people who use marijuana don't use methamphetamine or cocaine. But as the DA rightly said, 99% of those who ever use heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine also use marijuana in combination. And so, it's much higher than the prescription opiate issue that we've seen, although that has also, of course, risen in the last 20 years. Now, of course, some people will say, well, wait a minute, how did those people get to treatment? Now, we know that about 40-some%, almost half, went there as a result of a criminal justice referral. What does that mean? It means that for some reason that the kid or the adult was in the criminal justice system and the judge said, I'm referring you to treatment, which I think would be a good thing versus referring them to prison. If the choices are those two, I think it's good to refer them to treatment. But half of them are not having anything to do with the criminal justice system. They have to do with family, friends, school, self-referral. And I think that is pretty fascinating because we hear all this misinformation about. How many of you have heard this idea of psychological addiction or physical addiction? Does that sound familiar to people? Right, marijuana is, or the statement of, well, marijuana is psychologically addictive. Right, we've heard that a lot. Now the issue about that, I should say, is in the world of addiction and according to your brain, that's utter nonsense. There's no such thing as psychological addiction or physical. Addiction is addiction, whether it's to food or to whatever, to cocaine or marijuana. There are definitions about withdrawal and about cravings. Physical and psychological makes no sense. What people, I think, mean when they say that, they mean the symptoms being more physical or psychological, right? In other words, the anxiety versus the shakes with the opiates, for example, that you get. And I think when people think of heroin addiction, right, that is very physical, manifests itself in physical ways, right, withdrawals from opiates. Whereas, with marijuana, there is a withdrawal, but it doesn't manifest itself in a physical, violent withdrawal that opiates or heroin often do. And what's interesting is when I go visit, and I think I have about 736 or something like that, treatment centers in the last 5 years that I've had the pleasure of visiting and talking with the directors there. To a T, each of them talk about the difficulty of treating marijuana addiction for a couple of reasons. One, folks are usually in total denial. In other words, nobody thinks there's really a problem now. The person's grades have fallen, they're hurting themselves and people around them, they're not getting the job that they thought they should get. Those things are all happening, but they still just don't think it's that big of a deal, or their family. And so it's very difficult. Also, it manifests itself in more subtle ways than something like cocaine or meth or heroin addiction, which also makes it very difficult. And finally, one of the best analogies I heard ever given to me by a treatment director was that, and by the way, this is a northeastern, and you can tell I've been living in the Northeast for a while because it's an analogy having to do with a train, which I know on the West Coast, originally from the West Coast, we don't have as many trains as we do on the East Coast, so excuse the train analogy. But essentially what they said was, Kevin, the place that the user is in, whether they were addicted to heroin or cocaine or marijuana or alcohol, it's all the same place. The issue is how fast they got there. With heroin, meth, and alcohol, they're often taking the fast train to that destination. With marijuana and maybe some other drugs, they are on what we would call not the express train, but the local train. The train that takes a long time, it seems, to get to that destination. The train that you can hop on and hop off pretty easily. In other words, I'm using for now, and I'm not using now, but I'm going to use then, and I'm not going to use then. I'm in total control, is the thought, right? You're off and on. And also, by the way, when you're on that local train, if you're taking like a local train from, New York to some suburb, it feels like you're never going to get there. It's like, there's like 70 stops, in 3 hours. When are we going to get there? And then all of a sudden you're there. By the way, you're there a lot sooner than you might think. You're in that same place, and I think that's a really great way that the treatment director described it to me, is that you're going to the same place. The issue is how you're getting there. And yes, with a local train, you might be able to hop off and stay off, and it's true. That's why the marijuana addiction rate is lower than heroin or cigarettes. You probably can. There are fewer, much less likelihood of getting addicted to marijuana than there is to cigarettes or heroin or cocaine or meth. But for those that aren't able to get off the train, many of them end up in the same place. I think that's really okay, you go to the next slide. We'll keep going. Let's talk. So essentially what I'm saying is that the gulf has never been greater between the scientific understanding of marijuana's harms and the public's misunderstanding. The difference between when you Google marijuana and the hits that you get versus when you do a Medline search, which is an academic peer-reviewed, where all the peer-reviewed articles are of marijuana, is tremendous. In other words, the Medline search is saying, warning, hey, there are things we should be thinking about. Whereas the Google search is saying, it's not really that big of a deal. And I think there's just so, that's part of the reason we have so much misunderstanding is, unfortunately, most Americans don't hang out at the, annual conference of the American Medical Association. Anybody here there last week? Or American Society of Addiction Medicine, American Psychiatric Association, any takers? National Alliance for Mental Illness? No. American Cancer Society, by the way, that talks about this issue too? No. So, there is that natural disconnect that we see. You can go to the next slide. By the way, I really like this quote from High Times. I don't quote High Times a lot, probably don't understand why not, but I like this quote, which is very interesting. This goes back to that DABS issue that I said. I promise I'd get back to it. Essentially, like I said, the potency is changing, but also the way that marijuana is being consumed is changing. And so it's not so much the little reefer that's on the cliff that's being passed around for 100 people to share, as much as it is the really big blunt that's not being shared at all. Or one newer way in the last 10, 15, 20 years has been this method to extract the most amount of THC, the active ingredient, what gets you high, from marijuana as possible. And if you were to tell anybody in the early 80s, that you'd be able to soon ingest a product with close to 100% purity THC, I mean, you would be, listen, in Cheech and Chong's wildest dreams, that wasn't a possibility. No, not at all. And by the way, you'd also be laughed out of the scientific meeting, because if you told somebody that they could get a joint to smoke that was 100%, it's impossible. It's impossible to create that joint. But what has happened, and this is, wonderful American ingenuity, I guess, I don't know, is that we learned how to extract from marijuana, usually with butane, not always, but mostly, basically close to 100% THC. And essentially, the way that was described by High Times, I thought was really poignant, which is saying, with DABS, your local action news team gets to do a marijuana story. But instead of doing a marijuana story about hippies sharing a joint, though that's my words, they do a marijuana story that shows crack pipe torches used on sticky heroin-looking goo made from a process that blows up like meth labs. And if you've heard of these hash explosions happening in places like Seattle and Denver, and other places, I mean, Oregon also. Yeah, here, right here, okay. Here, in Marion County, okay. This is what we're talking about. And it's sort of like, law enforcement thought they could, get a partial refund for their methamphetamine hazmat suits that they thought they didn't have to use anymore. I hope you didn't turn it in because you have to use them again. Because the oftentimes what the chemicals and what's being used to extract this and what's after the explosion with this is enormous. And so we're talking about close to 100% THC that's essentially combusted and inhaled. Now, that's not the average user of marijuana, but the point is these things are becoming increasingly popular. And frankly, I think the reason this was written by High Times is because, frankly, it's not really good from a PR perspective. Let me tell you, if you're trying to defend marijuana from a PR perspective, you want the image to be the little joint that, the responsible adult uses once a month. You don't want the image to be a crack pipe torch used on a thing that looks like heroin that blows up like a meth lab. Not good for the communications experts in here, right? Not good for your public relations. So you can go to the next slide. Actually, you can go to the next one. Here's a picture, actually, of what some of this looks like. This is it at the end of the needle right there that's used. And then this is some of the products that we've seen, shatter and earwax and things like that. And, this is the 80, 90% that we call concentrates or BHO, butane hash oil, that's being used. Next one. Let's talk a little bit about this issue of medical marijuana. It's actually very simple from a scientific and from a public policy point of view, but it's been made a very difficult issue because it's an emotional issue. How many people in here would want to deny their mother or father or child anything that would give them relief within the last, let's say if they had 6 months to live or something? Anybody want to raise their hand and say I don't see one hand. Okay. So, maybe I saw one, I'm not sure. But, so the issue is nobody wants to deny anything that helps folks. But the issue is how do you then create medications that are safe for the public health. And doing so in a way that's compassionate, but also that's, we have some quality controls over. How many of you used aspirin last year? To get your aspirin, any of you grow a willow tree in your backyard and tear off the bark and chew it? Well, that's what aspirin is. Wouldn't you want to do it naturally? Why would you want to have big pharma take it over? Anybody do that? So the point is, aspirin, for example, comes from willow bark. That's what aspirin is. Chew it, acid that you create in your saliva, your salivary glands, produce the same thing that modern medicine 100 years ago turned into a pill. Okay? And that's normal. We get a lot of our medications from plants. That's the beauty of plants. And that doesn't, just because it's from a plant, it means it's inferior. It's probably better than if it was man-made. Okay, that's good. But we don't ask you to chew willow bark. Instead, we say, you know what? Go to a pharmacist or go to a drugstore and get something that, if you get a bottle of aspirin here in Keizer, well, you know that it's the same bottle you would get if you were in Honolulu or in Manhattan or in Birmingham. And that's I think, reassuring. I mean, can you imagine if every time you wanted to buy aspirin, you had to go and say, well, what were the growing conditions this year? Were there any molds? Was it tested for pesticides? What's the potency? And so the good news is we have that kind of system set up. Now, of course, that system also is responsible for plenty of drugs that are not good for us that have hurt us. We're talking about the opiates or many drugs that have been recalled and things like that. But at the end of the day, I think most of us say that we want to have some kind of scientific system set up to assure the safety and efficacy of our medicines. And what I'm trying to say, and I think what the Institute of Medicine report said, that was a long time ago now, 15, 16 years ago, is they said, yes, there are medicinal properties of marijuana, right? But we don't need to smoke marijuana, essentially, to get those medicinal properties, right? We wouldn't smoke opium to get the effect of morphine, would we? We thankfully have it in a standardized dose given by a health professional. I want, and I would wish, marijuana would be treated the same way. And if there are research obstacles, if there are things that are not allowing us to develop those things, we should get rid of those obstacles because we want that to happen. So you can go to the next slide. That's essentially what I just said. And you can go to the next slide after that. We actually, by the way, do have medications based on marijuana that, first of all, we have some already that are at a pharmacy that are synthetics. But we even have a natural whole plant extract going through the FDA right now that's in a mouth spray. Now, what's interesting about this mouth spray, which is called nabiximols, is that the mouth spray doesn't really, especially in the standardized dose, it's very difficult to get high on. In other words, it really doesn't get you high. And the reason it doesn't get you high is because it has more than just THC. By the way, it has the whole plant, but the parts that are sort of accentuated are THC and something called CBD. Anybody ever hear of CBD, cannabidiol, for kids with epilepsy? Sanjay Gupta maybe did a story on it. I don't know if any of you saw it. Okay. Well, essentially, scientists have found out over the last 10 or 15 years that CBD is another component of marijuana, and it doesn't get you high. By the way, if any of you could see the font from the graph I had earlier about potency, you will remember that the CBD was at 0. Because CBD, it's not technically at 0, but it's trace amounts in modern marijuana. In other words, it's been taken out of modern marijuana through a selective breeding process. And all those people that think that marijuana is natural and not genetically modified, like no GMO and all that, I know that's big on the West Coast. I hate to break it to you, today's modern marijuana is anything but non-GMO and natural because of the way it's been selectively bred and manipulated to increase the parts that get you high and take away the other elements. And one of the elements that's taken away from modern marijuana is CBD, because CBD removes the high. Now this company in England said, well, what if we got the CBD back in there? Actually, not only back in there, what if we increased it? And we extracted the whole plant from that into basically a liquid that was a standardized dose. And essentially they came up with this. And they found out it doesn't actually get you high because of the CBD. 1-to-1 ratio. As much THC as there is CBD. And when it's 1-to-1 ratio, it cancels it out. The high, essentially. And so this has been approved in 20-odd countries, including Canada, for a very long time. for things like multiple sclerosis spasticity and cancer pain, people who don't respond to traditional medications. Now we're hearing about pure CBD with no THC that is being used on some children, about 500 of them in this country legally through a special research program that's going on for kids that suffer very, very, very rare forms of childhood epilepsy that don't respond to traditional medications and whose parents are probably at the end of their rope, and I don't blame them. And they say, you know what, we don't know what the long-term effects of the CBD, because we don't know, by the way, what the long-term effects are. We don't know what the long-term effects of the CBD thing is, but you know what, we're desperate, we'll try it. And I don't blame them, and many have tried it. And many of them, it's worked for many of them, it hasn't worked for everybody. There are a lot of reports of false kind of promises that people thought it was going to work, and they saw it on TV and it didn't work. But it has worked for some people, and probably good enough for anybody to want to try. And so I just wish we would develop medications like this. And I know this sounds crazy, so that pharmacists can dispense them at pharmacies. I know that sounds radical. Versus a little storefront, where the pizza shop used to be that has barbed wire guarded by the 300-pound bouncer and $100,000 in cash in the back. I don't know if that's the best scenario for developing medicines. Whereas I think, using the scientific process is. It doesn't mean that I want big pharma, but I don't get funded by big pharma, nor do I get funded by big treatment centers or big alcohol or tobacco. But it doesn't make sense. We wouldn't also want to make this out of reach of affordability for people, because then there won't be as much of an incentive to use these quality products, so products that have quality assurance. So, we want to make sure it's affordable and that the research barriers are down. And that's really, folks, how I think we should have an adult conversation about a very, very emotional issue. The problem is we don't often have that conversation, and instead we show the one person that it helps, and then we just kind of go on that way, as opposed to looking at the data and the science. I'm going to go through this one because I realize that we have a lot to go, and yet we have about 45 minutes left, I think, in the evening. So that's what I mean. I don't want to do questions. So very quickly. It's a big myth that people are locked up in our prisons whose only crime is smoking marijuana, for crimes that only involve smoking marijuana. The idea that, we have law enforcement here, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but we are going around and finding people with, outlines of joints in their pocket and throwing them in state prison. Makes no sense. And I'll tell you, that's a very easy case for me to make in a state like Oregon, where you had the most lax marijuana law after Colorado and Washington in the country. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, it's just what the fact is. And that you really don't have people locked up whose only crime ever, with no priors, is smoking marijuana. Now, of course, if you're driving, 35 and a 60, and by the way, driving 35 and a 60 is probably just as dangerous as driving 85 and a 60. So a lot of kids that say, well, wait a minute, pot makes me a better driver because I'm driving slower. Doesn't work that way. But let's say you're driving 35 and a 60, you're driving your kind of erratically, you're swerving, your tail light's busted. And by the way, you haven't registered your car in 2 years. You have 6 kids in a car that's supposed to have 4, and you get pulled over. Okay, that would make sense. And the law enforcement officer peeks his head in, you can't even see your face because of the marijuana smoke going in the car. Well, yeah, then you're probably going to get written up and arrested for that. And you probably should, because we don't want stone drivers arriving. I don't have the slide on this, but we know after looking at all the data that driving under the influence of marijuana intoxication essentially doubles your risk of a car crash. Now, alcohol at least quadruples it, and when you put it together, it's even worse. I don't know what the number is on top of my head, but when you put alcohol and marijuana together, which is, they're usually used together, not as substitutes, especially among heavy users, when you do it together, it's even greater than that. But the point is, marijuana impairs driving. And yes, I think we would all, anybody think that person should not be arrested for driving while under the influence of marijuana? I don't think that that's a controversial thing. But the issue is there's this myth that there are these wonderfully law-abiding folks who have never done anything in their life other than using a joint once or twice that are being locked up for that. Now, if we talk about larger amounts of dealing and things like that, then yeah, it's going to be a different scenario. But I also think that we should look into laws that don't criminalize people for possessing marijuana. By the way, you've had a law here on the books since 1973. Yeah. So you're kind of 45 years ahead of what I'm saying. But, you know, the point, or 40 years, but the point is, you know, I don't think we should necessarily criminalize users or give them a record. You know, we don't want to give somebody a criminal record for doing something when they're 17, so that when they're 25 applying for a job, they have to tell their employer that they've been arrested. You know, we should think of much better ways with warnings and things like that to stop use. But, you know, it doesn't mean that therefore, you know, we can throw people in prison. So I think that's interesting. Let's go to the next slide. We can go to the next slide, because we don't have a lot of time, but we can keep going. We can keep going. Next. Okay, let's talk a little bit about Colorado and Washington. Because I think it is important. We have two states that are trying something. By the way, it's called an experiment by some people, but an experiment signifies that we're actually closely looking at the data and we're open to changing things if it doesn't look like what we're implementing is working. Remember that in science, like 9th grade science experiment? Yeah, or 6th grade. That's not really what we're doing, folks. An experiment is not what's happening. But there is a policy that's been implemented in Colorado and Washington. And it's interesting to just kind of see, well, what has the result been? Or not, I mean, not results very rarely, but what are we seeing? I think is interesting. So let's go to the next slide. Well, first of all, we're seeing a brand new industry emerge, very similar to the other addictive industries we have in this country, alcohol and tobacco. And you all know that addictive industries make money off of the small percentage of people who consume a lot of the product. Okay? It's why when you go to gamble in Las Vegas, you're not getting the penthouse upgrade if you just gamble $100, you know, a year on your birthday. You will get the penthouse upgrade if you gamble your life savings every other day on the craps table. And that's because when you're in industry, you have to encourage heavy use. It's the only way you stay in business. And by the way, alcohol is the same thing. 80%, according to the statistics, 80% of you drink responsibly and don't have a problem with it. And that's probably the same for a drug like marijuana. It's difficult to know, but probably. That means that 20% of you don't drink responsibly and drink to such an extent that it's damaging yourself and people around you and jeopardizing public safety. Now, do you know how much volume of alcohol that you 20% who drink irresponsibly consume of all the alcohol consumed in the country? You consume 80% of the alcohol. So let's remember, this is called the 80-20 rule, Public Policy Analysis 101, Pareto's rule, 80-20 rule. 80%, in this case, 80% of people use responsibly, 20% of people consume 80% of the volume of alcohol. So that means if you're in industry, you have to focus on that 20%. And this is, I think, what we're beginning to see in Colorado, focusing on younger, possible lifelong users who can be reliable customers, making it as easy and attractive to those folks as you can. And that's essentially what we've seen. So here we have the first pre-rolled marijuana cigarettes in Colorado. You can go to the next slide. We have it's not your eyes playing tricks on you, Nutella, which is a food item with marijuana. And I want to talk about this for a minute. You know, again, baby boomers, the idea of a, you know, marijuana lollipops or marijuana chocolate hazelnut spread. I mean, yeah, there were, when I went to Berkeley, yes, there were people making marijuana brownies for 40 years. That's not new. But we're talking about these kinds of innovative products that are essentially knockoffs from common products that are happening. And also products that specifically target kids. This isn't one of them, you'll see them later. That is what we have now seen more and more. Now, this wasn't since 2014, this has been happening for quite a while, but it's essentially been, you know, increased. Go to the next slide. The sodas and candy bars and chocolate ice creams. You know, a lot of people think, well, if I'm going to try marijuana, if I'm a naive user, are you going to want to try a smelly old joint or a scary thing that's on the end of a needle that looks like heroin, or some huge contraption that you're supposed to put your mouth on and vaporize? Or would you be more likely, like me, to want to try the thing that is, you know, laced with a lot of sugar and chocolate? That sounds a little more attractive to me than some of those other things. And I think to a lot of people it is too, especially, I don't know if you saw the Maureen Dowd column. Maureen Dowd is one of the most liberal columnists in this country, New York Times columnist, who went to Colorado and tried a marijuana candy bar and knew exactly what it was, and ended up saying that she felt like she had died. She thought she had died, was her quote. after eating it. And the response from, by the way, this industry, when you talk about, well, what do you think these things are really extra potent? The response is, oh, no. You have to divide, for example, this chocolate bar into 16 pieces and eat it over a 2 to 3 day period. I don't know about you and chocolate, but I'm definitely not dividing it into 16 pieces. I'm one of those guys that buys the $5 Snickers in the mini bar in the hotel. It's like ridiculous, but it's there. You eat it, it's a wine and so, this is what we're seeing more and more. We're seeing these sodas, and by the way, these sodas were created for people with, it was claimed for medical purposes. Because the 85-year-old person dying of cancer really wants the, snake, marijuana, monkey, orange flavored crush marijuana soda, right? These are the kinds of products that have emerged. Go to the next slide. And the other thing that I'm worried about now, folks, is the issue of vaporizing, especially e-cigarettes. For anybody that thinks that big tobacco has gone bye-bye, you have to look at the statistics about e-cigarettes and how young people are saying to themselves, well, smoking's really bad. Yeah, smoking's horrible. It's gross, it's terrible, it's smelly. But, e-cigarettes, they say, are good for you. So now you're seeing actually a rise in these electronic cigarettes. And now we actually know that the third largest tobacco company in the world, Japan Tobacco International, has bought a big portion of a startup in Silicon Valley that produces a vaporizer that can be used to heat vapor from marijuana and tobacco. And by the way, you plug it in, USB port to charge it up. There's no odor. And let me tell you something, if you're an 8th grade teacher that thinks that you can detect cigarette or marijuana use, good luck, because this thing looks like a pen that plugs into your USB drive. Not necessarily this one, but the ones that are out there. And so these are just new ways to conceal use that we're seeing. Now, again, if this was about allowing adults, 60-year-old adults, to smoke a couple of joints in their room, in their basement or something once a month, that's very different. I really don't care if that happens, actually, as long as you're not driving, performing brain surgery on me or my loved ones, or flying a plane. I really do care less, okay? Or coming to work. But otherwise, I can care less. But the issue is these are products that are appealing to young people on purpose. And so I think that's why many of us are concerned about just what we're seeing with these trends with youth marijuana use. Next slide. Oh, can you just, yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah, other way. Good. We already talked about this and keep going. Oh, by the way, here's one of the pens brought to you by Groupon. $39.99, and over 1,000 sold in the first few hours. And it's an Atmos dry herb wax and roll vaporizer kit in multiple colors and samples. Now, how many people in here would look at that in an office and know that that was to consume drugs or consume marijuana? Anybody? So it's just, I think this is what we're worried about, and this is why there needs to be more education to this. Increasingly popular and accessible, promoted by entertainment stars who are bragging on late night TV how awesome it is that this marijuana company is sponsoring them so they can get all the free pot they want. We need to think about the influence on young people when we see that. Next slide. Here are some displays of the cookies and candies and brownies that we're seeing in many places. And we're also seeing this in California, not just Colorado and Washington. But again, it's just turning on its head the idea of smoking a joint is the issue of marijuana. This is the new frontier here, are these ingestibles, the edibles. They look great, they're attractive to young people, they're attractive to new users, and there they are, very accessible. Next slide. You can keep going. So let's look at some of the data we have on what's going on in some of the medical marijuana versus non-medical marijuana states. Well, when kids are asked where their source of marijuana comes from, it's really good. The University of Michigan divided between medical and non-medical states. And essentially what they found was the third most popular reason, which was a statistically significant difference, between medical marijuana and non-medical marijuana state for a source of pot by a 12th grader was somebody else's medical marijuana recommendation. And so that has become a new source of marijuana for young people. So even if you think, you know what, even if you have back pain, you're the 35-year-old guy who wants pot, that's fine. Even if you think that's okay, the issue is this is being easily diverted to young people. And you know, I just gotta say, you'll notice that buying it from a dealer or a stranger is the fourth most popular reason. And that flies in the face of what I think a lot of, at least me when I was growing up, the commercials would show about, you know, who the scary drug dealer on the corner with the trench coat, remember that commercial, you know, selling all kinds of, hey kids, you know, look at what I have, and had like pills and marijuana and cocaine and heroin and all these things. That is not really a common scenario, because most kids, as this shows, in both medical and non-medical states, get marijuana from a friend for free, or they buy it from a friend. A much lower percentage gets it from a stranger. So it's not the scary dealer on the corner. And of course, in a medical state, even more than a dealer now is somebody else's medical marijuana. So I think that's interesting. Next slide. And actually, what the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol-Related Conditions came out with in the Journal of the Drug and Alcohol Dependence was that essentially states that had medical had higher rates of marijuana use and abuse and dependence, which I think is just interesting. This is all medical now, by 2004. This is the proportion of fatal crashes, drivers in marijuana positive in Colorado. You notice I just put an arrow on, actually I didn't do this, Dr. Thurstone did this, on medical marijuana implementation in 2009. 2009 was the time that we actually saw the rise in some of these problems, because that was when you had the widespread availability of stores where you could actually get marijuana. But I think that's also very interesting about the driving. Again, driving car crashes. Now, we don't know if the person who tested positive at the time of the crash, that the sole reason was the marijuana as the cause of the crash. You know, this issue of impairment in driving, I just think is a very, very difficult issue. Because frankly, to be serious here, marijuana does affect people differently. In terms of, look, if you're a naive user and you have, say, I don't know, a lower amount of marijuana in your blood than someone else who has a much higher amount in their blood, but they're not a naive user, that affects people differently. Because the naive user may actually have more negative consequences than the user who's used to the marijuana. It really complicates it then when we try and create a standard for impairment. You know, what's the standard for alcohol impairment? 0.08. By the way, that's not a scientific standard, that's a political standard. Plenty of people get into problems with 0.04, and plenty of people don't get into problems with 0.12. It's just that 0.08 is kind of where we decided is sort of a cutoff that we can live with. The same thing is for marijuana. The minute we start to make these, like, you know, this is impairment and this isn't impairment, marijuana affects everybody differently. It's processed very differently. It stays in your fat, by the way, unlike alcohol, which is not absorbed that way. So there are many things that we have to watch. You can keep going. This is all peer-reviewed published data. This is in, well, this was first at the American Association of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Journal, but basically they've been following in Denver, Colorado, the amount of marijuana in the urine of young people over time, and just looking at the amount and seeing the increase over time. You can go to the next slide. Childhood exposures, what does that mean? Actually, you can leave it here too, it's fine. It's the same thing, it's the issue of hospital discharges. You know, a lot of people and kids are getting their hands on these chocolate bars and these edibles unknowingly. I don't think anybody wants that to happen. It just happens to happen a lot more often, you know, when it's out there. And so these kids are, you know, there was a story, I was in Aspen, Colorado, at the Aspen Ideas Festival, and we were kind of debating, you can go back one, and then I'll talk. We were sort of debating, you know, whether this is a problem or not. And as we were debating, literally that morning, which we found out later, there was a housekeeper in the neighboring town, a poorer town than Aspen. It was like a satellite town of Aspen. There was a housekeeper that was cleaning a hotel room. And I guess there's a law there that if there's a food product that's unopened in a hotel room that's been vacated, the housekeeper could take it. I didn't know that. Okay. The housekeeper, there was a chocolate bar that was unopened. The housekeeper took it. It's an unopened, perfectly packaged chocolate bar, looks good. Housekeeper takes it home. Now, I don't know if she unwrapped it or what happened, but anyway, left it on the table, and her infant daughter I mean, it looks like a candy bar. Nobody can tell the difference. Took it and ate it, and they spent the night, at least 1 or 2 nights, in the emergency room. And that has been just happening a lot more common because you have these items that they don't look like cigarettes. They're not sort of difficult to ignite. They're things that are everyday food items that are disguised to look like marijuana. You can keep going. You can keep going. This is interesting. There was a report funded by the federal government that looked at the effect in Colorado and neighboring states and also other impacts, by the way. By the way, everything I'm talking about in this section comes from a few federally funded reports. First, the National Institute on Drug Abuse and what the research director has talked about. Also, this report by the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. And essentially what they found is 37 states are destined to receive Colorado marijuana. Often the states that actually don't have a lot of the production. And these are legal marijuana leaving the state. And so I think when a lot of people say, it doesn't really affect, what happens in one state doesn't affect the other, clearly it does, because we've seen this in Colorado, just in terms of where the marijuana is going. Next slide. You can keep going. And we don't have to talk about how much we see. We can keep going rather than questions. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is, I've given you, like Walt said, a lot of bad news today, and I don't want to give you bad news. I want to leave on a more positive note, because I think there is some room for hope for a lot of reasons. First of all, we are constantly being told that the drug problem is intractable, meaning you can't do anything about it, just learn to live with it. And I don't think that's true. When you look at the data around prevention and treatment and even law enforcement, you see there are things that work, that can work, and do work every day. I want to talk a little bit about community-based prevention. The crack epidemic was very interesting because it was an epidemic in the 80s that touched certain neighborhoods, and not every neighborhood. So it wasn't really I think it was overblown as a national epidemic. The levels never got to, I would say, epidemic proportions nationally, but they certainly got to epidemic proportions in certain neighborhoods and cities around the country. Now, in LA, where this was certainly an epidemic in the mid-80s, things were happening so fast with crack as a new drug that people realized they can't do prevention and treatment and law enforcement the same way that they used to do it, in their own back silos, not talking to one another. And someone essentially said, actually a woman who's a congresswoman now, was a pioneer of this, essentially said, look, if we're to tackle crack in our neighborhood, we need to know what the stats are from the treatment centers. We need to know what law enforcement is seeing. We need to hear what the faith community is seeing. The faith community plays a large part of the community there. We need to look at what business owners are saying in terms of their employees. We need to know the scope of the problem in order to actually address the issue. And so doing prevention by going into a classroom and just saying, this is crack, don't do it, wasn't really going to cut for certain neighborhoods. So essentially what happened was these kind of community-based planning with multi-sectors at the table, talking to each other for the first time, was essentially invented. And we have seen that model now all around the country. And we've seen major reductions in alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana as a result of that, using that kind of planning model. In other words, okay, well, what are you seeing, business owner? Well, business owner says, well, what I'm seeing is that in the park where a lot of kids are dealing drugs and not great things are happening, there are no lights in the park, and there are also no basketball hoops anymore. What if we just installed some lights and some basketball hoops? What would that do to change the environment in the community? And that's actually prevention. I mean, people don't think of that as prevention, but it is. So that kind of smart prevention and planning has actually produced reductions that we've seen. The other thing that we need to focus on, I think, is, you can go back, is brief interventions and sort of more involvement of our mainstream health system in the issues of drug use and abuse and dependence. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that right now, and this is also true of mental health, we segregate drug treatment. In other words, it's not part of the mainstream medical practice. It's not primary care physicians that are even trained. In fact, you'd probably be shocked to know that less than a third of primary care physicians receive any appreciable amount of training in addiction. And we want to treat this like a health issue, and yet we're not training our doctors. So we need to train our doctors on this, firstly. But secondly, we need to, the reason we need to train them is to be able to identify early, especially among kids, when drug use is happening, so that we can prevent it going down the continuum. Remember, drug use is a continuum. It's not like you tried it once and then you tried it a second 2 times. Maybe you try it 3 times and then the 4th time you try it, you're addicted. It doesn't work that way. It's a continuum and it's different for everybody. But what we do know, what does work for everybody, is the later you address it, the harder it is to address. And that's not surprising. It's like, imagine if we treated cancer the same way, right? If we said, you know what, you have first stage, early, stage cancer, we don't really have the time or resources. We're gonna wait until you have 4th stage cancer, and then we're gonna do intensive chemotherapy and radiation and throw, everything actually to save you then, hopefully. That's sort of how we treat drugs today in our healthcare system. We do not have an appetite looking at this early. Because most people say, I can handle my drinking. It's really not a big deal. I can handle my use. It's not a problem. And physicians often are not trained and equipped. In fact, physicians is probably the one occupation, I'm sorry to say, that we can blame for the prescription drug abuse epidemic. I mean, well, I dislocated my shoulder in 2001, otherwise healthy 25-year-old male, okay? 22-year-old male at the time. And when I did that, and I was, they put it back into place, and then I was given 150 OxyContins to deal with that, that's a problem, right? I didn't need 150 OxyContins. That's a big issue. And I do blame the physicians, and I also blame the medical system they grew up in, because it hasn't been equipped to train them in a way to properly prescribe this. And the reason we have an opiate epidemic, or we're sort of going, it depends on where you are, the reason why we've had an opiate epidemic, at least, is not because dealers are really into selling OxyContin. Now they are, or they were, but that wasn't the origins. Can't blame it, we can't blame this on Mexico. We like to blame our drug problems on other countries. You can't do that with this, with Oxy and with opiates. We blame ourselves because we didn't properly train. So we need to do a much better job. And many might be thinking, what does this have to do with marijuana? Well, again, marijuana, when we talk about marijuana problems, not casual use, not the adult who uses once a month, not the kid who tried it a few times. We're talking about the people who have problems, who are late to work and not going to work and not going to school and lying to their family and driving intoxicated. The people that have the percentage that have problems, there are often other drugs involved, and we need to be able to deal with them holistically, not in a vacuum. Anyway, so I think we really need to focus on the healthcare system. Let's go to the next slide. We have 25 million people in recovery in this country, meaning at one point in their life, they hit the lowest of the low and probably wanted to die, and yet today are not dead and are thriving and they're productive members of society. We need to celebrate that more. We need to talk about those stories more to give people hope that you're not consigned to a life of dependence. That there are ways out of this and at least to overcome it. And then, of course, to go to the next slide, we have to talk about the criminal justice system. Look, don't think that because I'm talking about the dangers of drugs that I think that the criminal justice system is just peachy. Because I don't. I think there are things that we could do to make it better. When you're trying to deter behavior, the best way to deter behavior is what criminologists would call swiftness and certainty, but not necessarily severity. Okay, what does that mean? It means that if there is going to be a punishment, it should be close to the time of the crime. It should be certain that it's going to happen. In other words, not vulnerable to where you are, and what this says, and what that says, but it doesn't have to be necessarily severe. And I think often in our, very genuine efforts to reduce crime, we can sometimes say, we want to throw the book at them at the maximum amount possible. And unfortunately, that's created an untenable situation that we can't handle often the cases in our system because of that. And, I think about the way we want to deter, if any of your parents are in here, the way you would convince your child to clean their room. Imagine if you said to little Johnny, Johnny, if you don't clean your room, there's a 37.2% chance that in 5 years, if I come around to it, I'm going to ground you for 7 years. It's a long time, 7 years. 7 years. And politicians debate, none of the politicians debated. Kids are gonna clean their rooms because I'm gonna give them a 7-year penalty if they don't. That would sound pretty good. No, wow, it's pretty severe. The problem is if it's a 37.5% chance and it doesn't happen for 5 years, then that's where you get into trouble. Because what if you instead told Johnny, if you don't clean your room right now in the next 30 minutes, there's a 100% chance that you are not going to the movies tonight. I bet you Johnny's going to respond to that more than he is that other threat. Of course, remember, other public policy lesson 101, the best threat is the one that is never carried out. So the minute you have to start carrying out threats, parents, or criminal justice system, you messed up. It's not deterring because you have to carry out on it. And so I think that oftentimes, for example, we have 5 million people in this country on probation or parole. And, we don't handle them, I think, in the most efficient way. And we also have people leaving prison, and we just assume that they're going to be model citizens as soon as they leave prison, without giving them the job prospects, the training, the support, really, that they would need to try to actually change their life. Because if you look at who we're arresting in this country, folks, they're not new people. They're people that have been in and out of the system and averaging 10 times. So we know who we're arresting. The guy that we arrested last year, the same guy. We have to try and stop that cycle. And when drugs are in the picture, I'm not giving you a criminology lecture here, that's not what tonight's for, but when drugs are in the picture, we know that in many different ways drugs contribute to crime. The black market for drugs fuel crime. Drugs themselves fuel crime by causing unpleasant behavior. The need for money for drugs causes crime. Those are really the 3 links to crime. But we actually know that a third of state prisoners and a fourth of federal prisoners commit their crimes while under the influence of drugs. And unfortunately, so these are the people, by the way, that are at the end of the spectrum. I mean, these are the people that are committing crimes under the influence of drugs. These aren't the casual adult users or the high school senior that's using it once a month. And we need to deal with that, I think, in the criminal justice system a lot better. Now, the hard part is, though, it's not so easy to deal with. And I'm not here to say that if only we just did this one thing, we'd be good to go. We don't, that's not the case. It's very difficult to deal with, actually. I mean, when you have a crime committed, let's say like a DUI, and somebody gets injured or something. Now, does it matter if that person who committed the DUI is addicted to alcohol, actually has a health problem? Well, in one sense it matters because, they have a health problem. It's different. In another sense, I don't care if you have a health problem or not, if it's your first time drunk or your 100th time because you can't control it, you just injured somebody on the road, you have to be punished for it. I think everybody would agree to that. And so when I think about integrating the criminal justice system and health, drug courts have been one way to do this. So this is Tiffany in Florida, methamphetamine, marijuana. And then you go to the next slide, this is Tiffany at her drug court graduation. Can't remember how, maybe a year or 2 later. And the point of bringing this up is when you combine sort of medical principles and criminal justice for real crime. I'm not talking about somebody who's possessing a small amount of an illicit drug. I'm talking about someone who committed a crime under the influence of the drug, and the drug is fueling the crime. You have to address both. And what drug courts do, they essentially bring physicians into the courtroom with prosecutors, with defense attorneys, with judges, and they say, all right, we are going to be tough on you, but we're also going to be fair, we're going to be smart. And we're going to say, we know you have a drug addiction. We know if we put you in jail for a year, in prison for a year, you're going to come out and you're going to do the same thing, probably. You have an 87% chance of reoffending. So rather than take that chance, I think we're going to get lucky, we're going to try to address your addiction in the criminal justice system, whether it's inpatient treatment, outpatient, whatever. And in exchange, we're not going to give you the criminal record, we're not going to give you as long of a time in prison, etc. And so that's been kind of one way, and it saves money. Now, of course, remember, this isn't the case for I'm not saying that everybody who ever tries any drug needs to go to a drug court or needs to get treatment. In fact, by the way, most people stop using drugs not because of treatment. They stop for many other reasons. Now, treatment is one way to stop people using. But we all know our president from not that long ago. How did he stop being an alcoholic? I'm serious. Did he stop being an alcoholic because he went to a treatment center in Texas? No. His wife said, you come home drunk once more, and I'm leaving, and it's done. And that was a threat that she never had to carry out, but it worked, and that's why it worked. Now, for some people that works, and for some people it won't work, because they're at a point where that doesn't even matter. And that's the peril of drug addiction when it comes to that point. And that's why families are ripped apart, because families can't recognize their child when some of these things happen. But again, not everybody. So this was one, I just want to show this really quickly, and then we're going to get to questions. I see we'll in 10 minutes. Is that there are other models of this. Project Hope in Hawaii was a model used for methamphetamine users. They actually were not given treatment. They were simply given the promise of 2 days in jail if they reoffended on probation. And that was a change, because before the judge would give them 10 chances, and on the 11th chance, the judge would say, all right, you know what, I gave you 10 chances. You're going to prison for 5 years. I'm done with you. Rather than doing that, the judge said, oh,